Well, the motive for this talk, or at least what stimulated, was the recent publication that came out on the Shrews and Moles of BC, which was a revision or update on the old museum handbook, the Possum, Shrews and Moles, I think it was called, the BC, going way back to 1996. This is a group of mammals that most of us rarely see. They're very cryptic. You really can't go out shrew watching, I'm afraid. So most encounters are finding a dead shrew brought in by the cat, or perhaps a shrew running across the forest floor, or perhaps sightings of mole diggings. In fact, they're actually quite a fascinating group. All the publicity seems to be recently on bats, but shrews and moles have some interesting traits as well, and we'll be looking at that tonight. Okay, so as I mentioned, this talk is really a spin-off from the release of the new handbook that just came out early this year. So what I'd like to do, covering this group tonight, we'll look first a bit at phylogeny, taxonomy, mostly just what are shrews and moles, where do they fit in with the rest of the mammals. I'll then talk a little bit about their natural history of the two groups, and then some selected species from southwestern BC, basically the lower mainland area, and then finish up with a bit about research needs. So what are shrews and moles? If any of you took zoology years ago, you may vaguely remember the order Insectivora, the insectivores. There were about 8 or 9 families placed in there, along with shrews and moles. It was long suspected that this was not a natural group. And recently, within the last 10 or 15 years, there's been an enormous amount of research done using DNA sequencing and molecular phylogenetics. And that research has revealed that the various families that were placed in the insectivores actually belong in 4 different mammalian orders that really aren't even closely related to one another. And the shrews and moles are in the order Eulepetophylla, which I must admit is a mouthful. It literally translates as truly fat and blind. There are a few blind moles, but neither of these groups of mammals could really be described as fat. So there are 4 families recognized. The Solenodons are 2 species found on islands in the Greater Antilles of the Caribbean. The moles, the hedgehogs, which are in Eurasia and Africa, and they are the closest relatives of the shrews, our 4th family. The scale on this phylogenetic tree is in tens of millions of years, and that's based on the molecular clock, which I'm afraid is something I can't really explain very well because I'm not a geneticist. But it puts this lineage way back a little more than 70 million years ago, which would put it into the late Cretaceous period, a time when the dinosaurs were still thriving. The closest relatives of the Eulepetophylla are the bats, the carnivores, the hoof mammals, and the whales. So we'll look first at the shrews. There are about 460 some odd species recognized across the world. They're everywhere except Australia and New Zealand. I think there's about 40 species in North America. We have 14 of them here in BC. And we've added 5 species since the 96 handbook, and some of those are new discoveries in that they're shrews that we didn't know were here that have now been discovered. And a couple of them are taxonomic splits resulting from DNA sequencing. Well, I think the most striking feature of shrews is they're small. So the shrew on the left that's sitting in my hand is the cinereous shrew. It's found all through the BC mainland. It weighs in about 4 grams, which would be the weight of an Anis hummingbird. The shrew on the right is the Etruscan shrew. It's found in the Mediterranean region. It weighs in about 2 grams, the weight of a large paper clip. and it's arguably the world's smallest living mammal. Well, there are costs or problems to being small. The one thing is it results in a very high metabolic rate. So most of our shrews, for example, would have a heart rate that would be a resting heart rate somewhere around 1,000 beats per minute. And to maintain this high metabolic rate requires a lot of fuel. And so shrews have to be eating every few hours to provide that energy. And if they're without food for 3 or 4 hours, they're probably going to starve to death. Now, the problem for shrews, unlike, say, hummingbirds, which can go into torpor on a cold day, hummingbirds can slow down their heart and metabolic rate, reduce any energy demands. Bats do this as well, and in fact, many of our smaller bats are roughly the same body weight as our shrews. The shrews can't do this, nor can they go into hibernation. And another consequence of the high metabolic rate is a short lifespan. It's as if the life of a shrew has been put on the fast forward button, and they generally don't live much beyond a year. 16 months would be the maximum lifespan of a shrew. The body of shrews is not very specialized. They walk on the soles of their feet. No particular adaptations for climbing and so on. However, we do have a group of water shrews that show some specializations. Now, all of our shrews can swim on the surface of water, but the water shrews have adapted to actually capturing prey underwater, so they can dive and remain submerged 20 or 30 seconds. The feet of the water shrews has a stiff fringe of hairs between the toes, and this seems to help with propulsion when it's swimming, pushing back against the water. And at least a couple of the species, this was something discovered by Nick Panter, the co-author on the shrew book. Some of them seem to have a small keel, a flattened keel at the distal end of the tail. What is specialized about shrews are their teeth, which really are different from any other group of mammals. So we're looking at the skull of a typical shrew. You can see the upper right tooth row and the lower right jaw or the lower right dentary bone with the teeth. The most striking thing is the red. This is actually iron that's embedded in the enamel of the teeth. It hardens the teeth, probably prevents abrasion and wear. The two front incisor teeth, the upper one you'll notice has these two prongs or cusps. The lower tooth is kind of strange, sticking out almost at a parallel to the jawbone. Those fit together like arms of a tweezer or forceps for grabbing and holding onto the prey. And then the sharp teeth at the back, obviously for grinding up the hard exoskeletons of invertebrates. Mammalogists are obsessed with teeth. If botanists are obsessed with flower parts of plants, and invertebrate, particularly entomologists with the genitalia of insects, with mammalogists it's teeth. And most of the identification taxonomy of shrews is based on various dental traits and various measurements of teeth, which it presents problems if you're trying to identify a live squirming shrew in the hand. The diet, and I should mention in reviewing the book, we could not find a single BC study on shrew diets. There appears to be no work done at all in BC. A lot of work's been done to the south of us in Oregon and Washington. And the diet's very broad. It covers just about every group of insects that you could imagine. The water shrews also, since they're taking a lot of prey in water, they feed on the nymphs or the larvae of various insects such as mayflies, stoneflies, dragonflies. Other arthropods eaten are centipedes, although apparently millipedes rarely show up in the diet. I suspect that's got something to do with toxic chemicals. And spiders. Other groups of invertebrates, earthworms are certainly a major prey, snails, even slugs, despite the body covering of mucus. And again, water shrews take small fish, minnows. And an odd one is seeds. They show up in the diet of most shrews. We still really don't have a good understanding of how important they are in the diet. The image here is of Douglas fir seeds. They seem to be one of the more common species that shows up in the diet of shrews. There are very few mammals that are venomous, and most of the known venomous mammals are all in the order Eulepetophila, and some of them are shrews. The best known example is a shrew found in eastern North America, the short-tailed shrew. That's been very well studied. This is a fairly large shrew, about as far as Canadian or North American shrews go. It's about 10 centimeters long, weighs about 20 grams, the weight of a deer mouse, which is the dead rodent below the shrew. The saliva of the short-tailed shrew contains a toxic substance, and various experiments in the lab have shown that it's administered in high enough doses, it's actually fatal for mice, for example. It seems more likely that the venom is used primarily to immobilize prey. So larger prey, such as a mouse or say a frog, it at least immobilizes the prey enough that the shrew can quickly kill the animal without a lot of energy and effort. Smaller prey, some of the invertebrates, insect larvae, and so on, it seems to act to actually paralyze the prey so they can store prey in their burrow and have the prey stored for several days, which could be a real advantage for an animal with high energy requirements. It's not a sophisticated delivery system, unlike, say, a viper snake. The venom simply flows out in the saliva and gets into the prey as the shrew is chewing on its prey. There are at least 15 or 20 shrews suspected to be venomous. We still need toxicological studies to demonstrate that they really do have a venomous saliva. And several of those species are found here in BC. For shrews, it's probably more than anything a world of smell. The males particularly have very prominent glands on the sides called flank glands. They produce very pungent, musky smells, especially during the breeding season. They also are very sensitive to touch. The whiskers or vibrissae on the snout are very sensitive and are used a lot for orientation and navigation. The eyesight is not that great. However, they do seem to have well-developed hearing, and shrews make quite a variety of sounds, various sorts of tweeting sounds and clicking sounds that we can hear. And it's been known for a long time that they also produce sounds above the range of our hearing, ultrasonic sounds. So these three sonograms were taken by a study done in 2018 on a European shrew. The vertical scale here is kilohertz. That's thousands of cycles per second. Our range of hearing, if we're young, is at best about 18 kilohertz. So these sounds are well above the range of our hearing. And the time scale is measured in milliseconds, a thousandth of a second. So these are very short, brief sounds. And in some ways are not that unlike the echolocation sounds made by bats. However, in this study and others, research has shown that they're not using these sounds to locate prey. It's not that sophisticated. Seems to be mainly used for just getting information on their general surroundings, locating obstacles, vegetation, and so on in front of them. The one group that's always been a mystery are the water shrews. The mystery being how would they locate their prey underwater, especially since some of their feeding would be done at night where there's no light whatsoever. The University of Manitoba, several researchers there carried out a major study on the American water shrew. They built a huge aquarium setup inside the lab, brought live shrews in, did experiments on them to test their physiology. And another study, they sorted out how they actually locate their prey. They were able to show that they do not produce sounds underwater. So they're not using any sort of a sonar system where they produce sound and listen to echoes. The whiskers seem to be highly sensitive to any sort of movement or wave action in the water. So they use that. And as well, they are able to emit bubbles through the nose and re-inhale those bubbles underwater and get chemical information. So essentially they're sniffing underwater, and they use that for tracking prey as well. There's a video, if you're really interested, if you go to YouTube and just type in a search on cheetah of the wetlands, you'll bring up about a 3.5-minute video from PBS Nature showing a water shrew feeding underwater. One sequence shows it capturing a crayfish and the other showing it capturing a dragonfly larvae. It's pretty spectacular footage. We'll move on to the moles. Fewer species here, about 57 species, found virtually worldwide except in Africa. And it is a very strange, eclectic mix of animals, some of them highly fossorial, adapted for burrowing. Others, several species like the Russian desmond, that's highly aquatic. And then other species that look almost shrew-like. We have 3 species here in BC. I think there's about 8 species found across North America. So we'll look at a bit of the natural history of moles. Size, we have 3 species in BC, and we'll be looking at them later. The smallest, the one in the top drawing here, is the American shrew mole, which is a mole that has some shrew-like appearance. It's quite small. It weighs in about 11 grams, which would be the same weight as a water shrew. It has an extremely high metabolic rate. In fact, if you were to plot its weight and metabolic rate on a graph of metabolic rates for shrews, it seems to have an even higher metabolic rate than you would expect for a shrew of similar size. I don't know anything about its lifespan. I couldn't find any information, but it apparently can consume its body weight in about 12 hours. Our other 2 shrews, some people call them true shrews, the highly fossorial burrowing shrews, they're much larger, weighing 70 to 160 grams, and certainly have a lower metabolic rate. One study showed the coast mole at least eating about 100 earthworms a day. However, that was a study in captivity, and you're never sure just how realistic that is for what happens in nature. Much longer lifespan than shrews. These large moles, the 2 burrowing moles, apparently live 3 to 4 years. Well, if we look especially at the 2 digging moles, these are really machines that are built for digging. The fur of the mole is short and velvety-like. It has no grains, so if you were to rub the fur of the mole, the fur won't stick up no matter which direction you rub, which is kind of handy if you're crawling inside the tight space of a tunnel. The front feet are very large with these huge, very powerful claws. There are no external ears. The eyes are tiny and a fairly well-developed snout. The shoulder girdle or the pectoral girdle of the mole is quite weird. The the whole shoulder joint is oriented differently from us, so that the shrew, when it's on the ground, the hands, it can't place its hands under the body, and in fact, it's supporting itself on the side of the hands, with most of the support on the thumb and the index finger. And the digging is done with the arms in that position, a side-to-side movement, not with a paddle-like movement. And that requires enormous, powerful shoulder muscles. The example of some of the mole diggings in tunnels, what we generally see, of course, above ground are the mounds of earth, the so-called mole hills that are on the surface. And those are a bit like the tip of an iceberg. Most of the construction and so on is underneath the ground, much deeper. Digging tunnels, the mole is shearing off soil from the side of the tunnel underground, pushing it backwards, and then pushing it up onto the surface of the ground. And this requires an enormous amount of physical energy. There's been research done on the environment in the tunnels, and they've found that there's very high carbon dioxide levels in the tunnels and very low oxygen levels. And it appears there's some specializations in the blood of the mole, and also myoglobin, the blood pigments in the shoulder muscles that make it more efficient for taking up oxygen. There are also shallow surface tunnels that are just under the surface of the ground. Those are typically what are used for feeding, when the mole's near the surface of the ground feeding. The depth of these tunnels really depends on the soil conditions and so on. They could be quite shallow, 2 to 5 centimeters. However, they can be a meter or more deeper in the ground. The females construct a very deep in the ground nest chamber, and that's where they give birth and nurse the young. Well, the world of moles is one of touch. This is the shrew mole, the smaller mole, the one that with some shrew-like appearances. Amazingly, it's blind. There is a membrane of skin grows across the retina, and all experiments suggest it is totally blind. And its world is largely one of touch. The tip of the nose, there's some organs called the Eimer's organs, which are really highly sensitive cells for touch. They're very sensitive tactile hairs along the snout and on other parts of the body, for example, the tail. There is some development of a sense of smell, and also they do produce some sounds. Now, the American shrew mole is interesting because some recordings that have been done suggest that it does produce sounds above the range of our hearing, ultrasonic sounds. At this point, nobody knows how these sounds are being used, whether it's being used for locating prey or whether it's used for some sort of communication. Our other moles, the digging fossorial moles I mentioned, they're not blind, but their eyesight is very poorly developed. At best, they can distinguish light from dark. The dentition of moles is not very specialized, quite different from shrews. You'll notice this is the skull showing the upper right tooth row. There's no red pigment on the teeth. The incisor teeth, the canines, those front premolar teeth are all simple pegs. The only high cuffs teeth are the cheek teeth, the molars, and a couple of premolars. And of course, the diet of moles, the predominant prey item, are earthworms. However, especially with the longer-lived moles of 3 and 4 years, there's a lot of grit in the digestive tract of earthworms, and there's certainly in older moles somewhere on the teeth. So that sort of covers off some basic natural history points. So what I'd like to do now is to go in and look at some of the species found in southwestern BC. as examples, and also examples of some of the issues around conservation. So for this part of the province, there are 8 species of shrews. It's the highest number of shrew species of any part of the province. As part of a bigger pattern, there's 2 areas in North America with high numbers of shrew species. One is the Pacific Northwest, ranging from, say, California to southwestern BC. And the other is Appalachia in the US and its extension into eastern Canada. And these are 2 areas that have very wet mesic forests, and that seems to be important for shrews. So 8 species in this area. One of them is endangered, listed under the Species at Risk Act. It and 2 other species are on the province's red-blue list. There are 3 species of moles. One of those is also endangered, and it also appears on the red-blue list. About half of the shrews and all of the moles are what I would describe as Pacific coast species that range from coastal California up to southwestern BC. I'll touch on a couple of recent taxonomic studies. This was some work that came out in 2014, and the main researcher on this project was Andrew Hope, who was a PhD student at the time at the University of New Mexico. And he gathered up 200 genetic samples of water shrews from 70 different locations across North America. Until recently, we thought there were 2 species of water shrews in North America, the Pacific water shrew and the American water shrew. And his work looking at mitochondrial nuclear DNA shows fairly clearly that there are 4 groups that are now being recognized as distinct species. 3 of them, the Western water shrew, the Pacific water shrew, and the American water shrew, all occur in BC. And we're actually the only jurisdiction in North America with 3 species of water shrews. 2 of these occur in southwestern BC. So I'll first mention the Pacific water shrew. It's another one of these Pacific coast species from southwestern BC to California. Seems to be a theme that will come up again and again here. It's been listed as endangered under the Species at Risk Act. And it's probably had more attention paid to it than any other shrew in BC. In fact, probably than all of the other shrews combined have not had as much attention paid to them as the Pacific water shrew. So a recovery strategy came out in 2009. Work's been done on critical habitat, best management guidelines, habitat modeling, and so on. I should mention these range maps that I'm going to be showing were all done by the BC Conservation Data Center. So I'm very grateful to them. They produced the maps, the same maps that got into the book. And they are using a system based on the eco-sections of the province. There's 130, I think, eco-sections that cover the province. And so if there's an occurrence within an eco-section, that eco-section is shaded in, even though we don't know for sure that the animal's necessarily evenly distributed through the eco-section. But that explains the shading on the maps. The water shrew is associated with wetlands, streams, creeks that are the typical habitat would be in forested area with lots of forest plant cover along the edge of the watersheds and lots of ground cover of natural vegetation, woody debris, and so on. Here's an example of really 2 extremes. The image on the right is taken of one of the areas selected as an example of critical habitat. I think there's 22 sites were selected by the Ministry of Environment. This one is near 80th Street and River Road, so I think would fall within the boundaries now of Burns Bog. And there's an extensive hardhack habitat along the edge of the ditch and lodgepole pine forest. There were water shrews, Pacific water shrews captured here during the assessment that was done for the South Fraser Perimeter Road, the Highway 17 upgrade. On the left is the other extreme, not all that far away down River Road, where several Pacific water shrews were captured in minnow traps set by somebody doing a fisheries survey. And you'll notice the water looks of very poor quality. There's a very distinct sheen of oil on the surface that probably comes from the road or some industrial area nearby. Most of the vegetation are introduced plants. So I'm actually amazed that a water shrew would even survive in these habitats. This is probably not atypical of some of the wetland habitats in the more developed parts of the lower mainland. You know, you think of the scale of urbanization that's taking place with industrial residential development. There's certainly been a major impact on many of the wetlands, streams, and creeks. However, the story may not be quite that simple. This is a map of occurrences that was taken from the 2016 COSERIC report. And the solid dots are recent records, although some of those go back to the 1990s, and the open dots are older historical records. Despite all the work's been done, there really hasn't been any systematic survey for this shrew. Most of the occurrence records, at least the recent ones, come from environmental assessments that are done related to highway developments or expansions, various types of urban or industrial development. And so those tend to be focused in areas where there's already a fairly large impact from human population. We really don't know the northern extent of the range, just how far up some of the valleys in the coast mountains this species occurs. There has been a capture near Squamish, and we really don't know the eastern limits of the range. I think the easternmost occurrence here is somewhere south of Hope, Silver Hope Creek, but it could well extend to the Skagit or even western Manning Park. The other unknown really is the elevational range. There's been no study done surveying, say, a transect along a series of elevations. It's been assumed that it's generally found below 800 meters elevation, but I'm not really sure what the basis is for that. Also have very little information on its diet. It has been well studied in other parts of the range. The only BC specific information I could find was a museum specimen collected years ago by Ken Racy, and he had noted on the specimen tag that the stomach was full of water beetles. Another subject that we really don't know a great deal about is a second species of water shrew that occurs in the lower mainland. This is the western water shrew. It's found all across the mainland, with the exception of northeastern BC, and there it's replaced by our third water shrew species, the American water shrew. There is a population on Vancouver Island, and it's treated as a different subspecies, and it's on the province's blue list. But the mainland population is secure. Ranges from Alaska all the way down to New Mexico and Arizona. Easy to distinguish from the Pacific water shrew. If you add the two in the hand, it has this very dark blackish dorsal fur and a silver gray belly. It occurs in a number of locations in the lower mainland within the same range as the Pacific water shrew. So it's been found in the North Shore Mountains, Capilano River, for example, the UBC Research Forest, captured at Cultus Lake, Chilliwack Lake. All of these are historical captures going back more than 30 years ago, but certainly suggests that it's within the same range extent in the lower mainland. We don't know what's going on between these two species because nobody's really looked at it. Are they in competition? The Pacific water shrew doesn't have a heel on the tip of the tail, and the hairs on its feet aren't as well developed as the Western water shrew. So it may be that the Western water shrew is occupying a different niche, perhaps fast-flowing streams more than quiet wetlands. That's something that really needs to be looked at. Another shrew that's on the province's red list was a shrew only discovered in 2007. Now, discovering a new species of insect or fungi in the Pacific Northwest wouldn't raise too many eyebrows, but finding a new species of small mammal is quite unexpected. Not only in BC, but certainly in Oregon and Washington, biologists with the U.S. Forest Service have done extensive small mammal work. So discovering a new shrew was not something expected. The discoverers were a couple, Virginia and Robert Rausch, who at the time were in their mid-80s, around the time this photo was taken when they published their study in 2007. They had spent most of their career in Alaska, working on everything from shrews to bears, and in retirement had an association with the Burke Museum at the University of Washington, and were carrying out a shrew study in the Olympics and Cascades. We're capturing a shrew that didn't seem to fit with any of the keys, and they eventually concluded they had a different species, and collaborated with a geneticist who ran some DNA sequencing, and sure enough, it turned out to be something quite distinct. And their results got out 2007. Now, at that time, they did come up to BC and looked at some shrews in the collections of the Royal BC Museum, but oddly only looked at some captures from Burns Bog and identified some that were Olympic shrews. So that led to a lot of excitement that we had this new shrew in BC, and it was confined to Burns Bog. Well, I guess there's always troublemakers, so myself and Nick Panter were a little skeptical of the Burns Bog limitation. So we decided to look at all of the museum specimens we could get our hands on from southwestern BC, went through them looking to verify the identifications. And this shrew can only be identified looking at teeth or taking measurements from the skulls and teeth. You could not identify it from external features in the hand. And it turns out we found Olympic shrews from 13 locations in BC, going back to the 1890s right through to 2004. They're all found on the south side of the Fraser River. This bit of shading that extends up on the east side of the coast mountains is because of a strange ecosection. There are no occurrences that we could find on the north side of the Fraser. The habitat, and all we can do really is to go back and look at these historical captures to try to get some idea of where this thing may be living. The top left and the bottom right photos were both taken in Burns Bog, and these were sites where shrews were captured in 1999. That was during the Burns Bog ecosystem review. The photo at the top left comes from an area just southeast of 80th Street, and it's lodgepole pine with Labrador tea. And the image on the right is from the end of 96th Street in a dense stand of birch. So these were two sites where shrews were captured that turned out to be Olympic shrews. We also discovered some historical specimens dating from the 1890s that were in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. They were collected by Alan Brooks, a well-known naturalist birder in his day. In early days, in the late 1800s, Brooks lived outside of Chilliwack in the Fraser Valley. collected a lot of small mammals that he sold to various natural history museums around North America. And some of the shrews he collected from Mount Leumshin turned out to be Olympic shrews. Now, unfortunately, we have no idea exactly where he was on the mountain. There's no specific location details and no information on the habitat. There's been some recent work done down in the Cascades in Snoqualmie Pass, and they found Olympic shrews there in Snoqualmie Pass. So it's quite possible it could get up into the Cascades. So at this point, we struggle with really not much of an understanding at all about its habitat. If it is forest dependent, then one might be concerned about habitat fragmentation on that south side of the Fraser. As far as I know, there's been no work done on this shrew since our study came out in 2009. Another shrew that's on the province's list, the blue list, is Trowbridge's shrew. It's another one found on the south side of the Fraser. A bit of a mystery. There are 3 historical occurrences on the north side of the Fraser River that date way back 30 to 50 years ago. But several surveys recently, no one's been able to find this shrew. So we really don't know its status there. South of the Fraser, it's a common species in forest habitats. It's very much a forest species found in mixed forest, coniferous forest, and often is the dominant shrew species in those habitats. There was a survey done in the early 90s. Several students from UBC had surveyed about 40 or 50 sites across the lower mainland looking at small mammals. And they found this shrew in a number of locations south of the Fraser River, though in their report, they were concerned about fragmentation, that these forest patches were getting quite disconnected. And almost all of the blue dots that are on this map are occurrences from 30 years ago or more. And I would suspect that if we had a re-examination of some of these sites, we may find that some of these habitats are now gone. The northernmost occurrence is just east of Boston Bar. I mentioned this as another example of the effects of DNA work on taxonomy. In the past, there's been a widespread shrew across Western North America that occurred all across BC called the dusky shrew. And in the early 2000s, I think it was 2001, a couple of biologists at the University of Alaska did a major genetic study on this species. And they found that the coastal and interior populations were quite distinct genetically. And they waffled a bit. They suggested they may be different species, left it at that. And recently, a big monograph just came out of the Smithsonian reviewing the taxonomy of North American shrews and moles. And they took the plunge and formally recognized the coastal forms of the dusky shrew as a different species. So it would be called the Pacific shrew with the scientific name Sorex pacificus, and it ranges from Alaska all the way down to Oregon. One of the more interesting things about it is its occurrence on islands. It occurs on more than 100 islands along the BC coast. We'll now move on to moles. There's only 3 species. We'll have a look at them. The coast mole is one of the 2 fossorial moles that some people call true mole. It's very widespread all across the lower mainland at lower elevations. It ranges, I think, about as far as Hope. You see their diggings everywhere, gardens along the edge of even Highway 1. I've noticed mole diggings. There has been quite a bit of work done on this animal in BC, going way back into the 1940s through the 1950s. There was a biologist at the Agricultural Research Station, Agassiz, who looked at this mole. He did collect some interesting natural history information on breeding and reproduction and distribution, but his main focus was on control, how to kill them, the most effective way to kill them, and how to eradicate them from farmland. He did do a diet study, and no surprise, found that more than 90% of the food eaten were earthworms. Now, the earthworms is a curious story because the earthworms, to my knowledge, that are found in the Fraser Valley, none of them are native species. They're all species that have been introduced from Europe. There was another mole study done in the 1970s by a student at Simon Fraser University, Val Shaper. And he took earthworm samples from his study areas and had them identified. And it turned, I think he had a dozen different species of earthworms. All of them were introduced species. So it does raise this intriguing question of what these moles were feeding on before humans, European settlement and the introduction of earthworms and the clearing of forests. The populations of this mole seem to be closely linked with the populations of earthworms. It's on Schedule B of the Provincial Wildlife Act, which, to put it politely, means that it's viewed as a pest. And so if it's damaging your property, it's legal to trap or kill this mole. And this has some consequences for another mole species. Very easy to identify these moles if you found a dead one. Other than the Townsend mole or other species, there's no other mammal that looks even closely similar to them. So our other mole is Townsend's mole, which has a very restricted range south of Abbotsford around the village of Huntington. It's much larger than the coast mole. It's as if it were a scaled up version of the coast mole. The only thing that you can use to really identify the two is size. And there's some measurements you could take if you had the shrew in the hand, or if you even had two of them side by side, there'd be no confusing them because of size. It's, because of its range and various threats, it's been listed by SARA as endangered. There was a recovery strategy done in 2015, and also the mapping of critical habitat. Interesting history here. Until the 1990s, this mole was only known from some museum specimens going back 40, 90 years ago that had been collected at the Racy Farm, which was just to the west of Huntington. And it wasn't until the 1990s that a student at UBC, Tim Sheehan, got interested in the mole. He got some funding from the Ministry of Environment and carried out a major survey. And he confirmed that there was still a breeding population in this area near Abbotsford. And he also discovered a new population just north of Highway 1. In around 2015, I think it was, I was contracted to develop a recovery strategy for Townsend mole and also develop a map of critical habitat. And for the map, I worked with a GIS specialist, Pablo Yost, who put together this map. This is a draft of the map of critical habitat that would eventually get in the recovery strategy. So the symbols are simply all of the known occurrences of Townsend's mole. You can see the city of Abbotsford. Huntington is this village. See here if I can bring up the laser pointer. Huntington is this village here just north of the Washington border. There's other occurrences around the Ledgeview Golf Course and a subdivision to the north of Highway 1. The total range extends about 20 square kilometers, and curiously, it seems to be mostly associated with a very special soil type, the Ryder and the Marlborough Hill soil types. I'm not a soil scientist, but I gather these are fairly loose soils. The coast mole, on the other hand, occupies a wide range of soil types, and the coast mole is also found in this same area. There's been no overall inventory of Townsend's mole really done in the past 20 years, and we actually don't know if most of these symbols still even have active mole burrows at the site. About 60% of the range is in the agricultural land reserve, which is reassuring. However, in the recovery strategy, some of the threats that came up were, first of all, land getting flipped out of the ALR, something like mega greenhouses being built on farmland or gravel pits. And another concern, of course, is direct killing, because the coast mole can be trapped and killed. And so Townsend's mole could simply be killed accidentally as part of another mole control program. In 2022, I went back to the Huntington area actually to get photographs to use in the book. And I hadn't been there since the mid-1990s when the first shrew mole book was done. And I was quite surprised that almost all of the pasture land where there were once mole colonies, pasture land's been converted to blueberry. There was very little pasture land left, and any mole diggings I saw were on the lawns of residential areas. And I wasn't doing a survey measuring mounds. One of the things you can use to distinguish the coast and Townsend mole is the height and width of the mole hill itself. I wasn't concerned with that, but I didn't see any mole hills that were of a size of Townsend's mole. This image on the right is interesting because in 2010, there was an environmental assessment done here looking for Townsend's mole, and people doing the assessment did find a number of mole hills that they thought were Townsend's mole. I suspect the assessment was done because of proposal to develop a blueberry field. And when I returned in 12 years later, the pasture land's gone and there's a huge blueberry farm here. I did talk to the farmer, and he told me that they rarely see moles in the blueberry fields. The area to this light green area beyond the blueberries, interestingly, in here, this was also pasture land when the assessment was done back in 2010. It's now a cornfield. It's actually in the state of Washington. And by accident, as we were wandering down looking at the blueberries, we had crossed the border, and I guess had triggered off some camera and caused great excitement. And that was why the farmer came out to find out what we were up to. But again, loss of pasture land here, which would reduce any connectivity with Townsend moles that are nearby in Washington state. My working hypothesis would be that the mole perhaps is extirpated now. It's gone. The one area, curiously, where it could be is the Matsqui Penitentiary Center. Driving by there on the road, I noticed a lot of mole diggings on the lawns. That's a fairly large area. It's also federal land, which means it would be subject to the Species at Risk Act. I suspect if you were to approach Corrections Canada, you might not get a very warm reception to the idea to wander around the prison looking for mole diggings. If there's a positive story in all of this, is the Sumas Prairie flood in 2021 largely missed the core range of Townsend mole. There was some areas just to the east of Huntington where there are a few historical records that got flooded, but the core area was missed and the area north of Highway 1 was missed. Evidently in 1948, when there was a huge flood of the Fraser River, a spring flood, there were reports by farmers of numbers of moles being seen swimming. moles can swim, presumably swimming for their life, trying to get to dry ground. The research station at Agassiz reported that there was a decline in the coast mole population after the flood, but the population quickly recovered. And Glendinning, the biologist, speculated that it was probably more a decline in earthworm populations than drowning of moles that resulted in the population decline. Our final mole is the American shrew mole. That is a mole that in many ways looks as much like a shrew as it does a mole. It's easily identified, and I noticed there's a tremendous number of photos posted up to iNaturalist, and we used a number of these in the map. I suspect perhaps owls have picked them up and dropped them. It has a very strong musky smell, and perhaps it's just thought to be unpalatable. Many of the iNaturalist photos had original IDs of shrews, but it really is quite easy to distinguish from a shrew. It has a shorter tail, a very fat tail that's constricted near the body and has very long claws on the front feet. And it's about the size of a water shrew. It's another forest species. It tends to live in a mixed forest, moist coniferous forest, gets up into high elevations in the Cascades. It's found as far east as Manning Park, gets up into the Squamish area and on the Sea South Peninsula. The diet is quite diverse, much more so than our other moles. The only BC specific information I could find, again, was a note from Ken Racy done years ago. He observed small earthworms, insect grubs, and beetles in the stomach of some of its captures. In Oregon and Washington, there have been reports of fairly large amounts of seed being found in the stomachs as well, conifer seeds. The species at one time, I think, was on the blue list. It's been taken off. It certainly isn't at risk, but one does wonder about some of these populations on the south side of the Fraser, where there's probably been a loss of habitat over the last 20 or 30 years. So that's just a quick review of some of the more interesting species in the lower mainland, southwestern BC. One of the takeaways from all of this is, in terms of conservation or management or just understanding these animals, we're really working with an incomplete deck. It isn't just missing a few cards. We seem to be working in some cases with a partial deck. We really need more surveys being done, targeted surveys. Environmental assessments are certainly helpful. And without those, we'd probably have far fewer symbols on the maps. But those tend to be biased geographically for certain specific areas. We really need to get some surveys done where we can flesh out the full range extent of these species. Also looking at some of the locations where there are historical records to try to determine if those sites are still occupied or if the habitat's even still there. And another thing that really needs more work is their occurrences in some of the protected areas. When that big study was done back in the early 90s by the two students from UBC, they could not get permission to trap small mammals in the regional parks or the provincial parks. So none of their study sites were in protected areas, and that's an area where we really need more information. The big push now, it seems, in conservation biology is producing models that predict the actual range of a species. So rather than just filling in an eco section, which is a nice start, these are much more realistic maps that are based on all sorts of data that are collected at the occurrence sites, the climate data, habitat data, and so on. And those can be used by playing around with various variables. They are trying to model or predict how the range might look, say, in 20 years with climate change or habitat change. Will the range shrink? Will it become more fragmented, for example, and so on. Another thing that needs to be done, rather than this one species thing of looking at Pacific water shrews and really nothing else, we really need a study with a more of a community ecology approach with shrews, particularly. The 8 species found in southwestern BC, we really don't know how these species co-occur together in different habitats, how many species are found in a community and what species are the dominant species and so on. These are things that really should be looked at. One of the problems with shrews and moles is we just can't go out and watch them very easily. Detecting them requires generally the use of traps, live traps, such as the Longworth trap, modified minnow trap for capturing water shrews, pitfall traps. These are also the Longworths and the pitfalls quite effective for catching American shrew moles. And there are live trap designs for capturing moles, although they do involve quite a bit of effort and disturbing tunnels and so on. The problem with the trapping is, first of all, you have to have permits and authorization to handle live shrews, but also the traps have to be checked frequently because of the concerns of the shrews dying from starvation. A lot of recent focus now on external DNA, eDNA, and one approach has been to try to take water samples and see if they could detect water shrew DNA in the water. So far, that hasn't been successful. Another approach, one that's been used in Britain and also in the Maritimes, a very simple trap using a PCV tube. One end is covered with just some mesh. It's very narrow, just big enough for a shrew to fit in. The shrew could go in and out. There's no danger or concern about the shrew dying of starvation. It's baited with things like either blowfly pupae or mealworms. And then tubes are picked up and any scats or droppings inside can be analyzed in sequence for DNA. The one study in the Maritimes, they were looking for a rare shrew that's endemic to the Maritimes of Canada, and they were able to detect it from DNA in the shrew droppings in the trap. So this is a technique that may have a lot of potential. So where does that leave the citizen scientist, the naturalist, who probably doesn't have permits and so on for collecting shrews and certainly doesn't have funding for DNA sequencing? Certainly the mole images that have been put up on iNaturalist were very useful, photographs of American shrew moles, dead coast moles, and also coast mole burrows. To be honest, with the exception of a few Western water shrew photos I've seen, almost all of the shrew photos on iNaturalist are really not useful. Looking at those, I couldn't objectively identify them to species. It would help if people could photograph them in a couple of standardized poses, dorsal and ventral, and with some kind of a scale bar. But I'm afraid for many of these shrews, we also need to look at the dentition. And unless you're able to take some close-up images with your phone of the dentition, which seems to me pretty difficult, a better approach, if you think you have something unusual, would be to deposit it with a natural history museum. So the Beatty Biodiversity Museum, for example. Even a decomposing shrew, if we can get the skull out and look at the teeth, we can make a reliable identification. Moles, it is in the book, some dimensions given where you can take measurements on mole hills, fresh mole hills, for separating the coast mole from Townsend's mole. Another area where naturalists can contribute are owl pellets. We have had owl pellets, a lot of them were collected by the late Glenn Ryder, who was a very keen naturalist. He collected barn owl pellets from several areas on the edge of Burns Bog. One of them, as I recall, we discovered Pacific water shrew in the pellets. We've also found American shrew mole remains in the pellets. So this is something that could be useful if you were surveying an area and wanted to get more information on possible shrew mole occurrences, would be collect any owl pellets that you could find. And I think I'm going to stop there. I've pretty much used up my time, and it might be best now to take on any questions you may have. Boy.
Yeah, Dave,
Yep.
can you hear me okay? Yeah, Dave, Murray Lashmar. I found the kind of the reclassification interesting. I guess it was now about 13 or 14 years ago when they were doing the Port Mann extension. I was working for Martin Gebauer. I'm not an expert in small mammals, but we were doing all sorts of stuff like that. And I remember we were getting dusky shrews, vagrants, and things like this, and seeing all these new classifications and new species makes me realize that, man, some of the stuff that we got, we made our best guess, and I'm sure that at one point or another, depending on what we were getting, we might have run it past you. But I can imagine that some of the things that we were trying to identify might have been misidentified, and obviously totally misidentified based on the new classifications.
Yeah, well, actually, you've raised a point. I was going to mention it in the talk and I forgot. There was a woman recently did a master's thesis on shrews in Snoqualmie Pass. You don't find too many studies focused only on shrews, but she snipped off a very tiny end of the tip of the tails of all of her live captures and applied some sort of a coagulating chemical. It got past the animal care committee of the university she was at, and she had them sequenced for DNA and based her identifications on those. And she found a very high incidence of misidentification. She was identifying live shrews in the field and then testing those against the DNA. So it was actually quite disturbing how high the misidentification rates were. And if the funding's there, it seems to me it would be pretty easy to develop some sort of a standardized technique to get a small bit of tissue that's preserved and ultimately sequenced for DNA to get a reliable identification. We've been doing that with bats. They've been doing that for quite a while with sequencing DNA in bat pellets. I don't see why we couldn't do it with shrews.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I probably got a few photographs that we took at the time, but as you point out, depending on what the species is, it's pretty hard to identify much of anything. I guess sounds like the moles would probably be easier than the shrews.
The water shrews would be easy to identify. And I guess the frustration I have with some of the photos, if they were just only with a dead shrew, I can understand a live shrew that's moving. But a dead shrew, if you could just lay it out so you could get a good photo of the dorsal fur and then turn it over and a nice photo of the ventral fur. Often the shrew's curled up in a ball. You can't really see any of the pelage characteristics at all. So that would help if a little more care was taken in the photo.
Yeah. Interesting. Anyway, thanks, Dave. No, this is really interesting, really useful.
Dave, is there any way you could undo the share screen now? And then you'll be able to see everyone and see who has questions.
Okay. Yep, I've done that.
Oh, good idea. There.
Okay, thanks.
I think I see Teresa has a question. Is that right, Teresa?
Yes, I actually have several questions, but I'll do one and then you can do the ones in the chat and then I'll do my other ones. So one was you mentioned that there were lots of shrews on islands, including the Haida Gwaii, and I'm just wondering, would they have evolved there, or would they have kind of traveled there on, I mean, do they burrow into like rotten wood logs that would float or something, or how would they cover such a distance? I guess they're pretty primitive, so.
Well, that's a very good question, and I gave another talk on shrews and went into this island business a little more detail. Generally, most of these islands, it's only one species of shrew, the Pacific shrew, that's on over 100 islands, including Haida Gwaii. Some of the islands probably were connected to the mainland at some point in the early post-glacial, and shrews may have got across when there was dry land and then got isolated off with rising sea levels. Another good example of that would be some islands off the north tip of Vancouver Island, the Scott Islands. There are, I think, 4 or 5 islands. The closest to Vancouver Island is about 10 kilometers of open water. Shrews were found on that island, Pacific shrew, way back in the 1950s. Those islands were all connected to Vancouver Island about 11,000 years ago. They were all part of the continental shelf. And then with rising sea levels, they got cut off and were fragmented as islands. And so those shrews didn't have to cross water. They got isolated there with those rising sea levels. However, many of the other islands, the only way shrews could reach them would be crossing water. We did do an analysis of small islands at least, and we found that most of the small islands were within 1.5 kilometers of another island with shrews. And interestingly, work that's been done in Europe, Scandinavia, they've shown that shrews are able to swim across water gaps, both in freshwater lakes and in the ocean, of water gaps up to 1 kilometer, which is hard to imagine given the metabolic rates and problems with hypothermia and starvation and so on. But that was one of their findings.
One of the questions that's come in on the chat was about the extreme cold spells and how the shrews are able to deal with those, the ones that we've had this winter, for instance.
Yeah, further north, where there's permanent snow cover, shrews are generally in that subnivean zone. They're on the ground underneath the snow, where there's actually a fairly stable temperature regime. There's several studies have been done showing there's a surprising number of invertebrates in that area. I think it would be more challenging here, where there isn't snow cover and you suddenly get a real snap of cold weather. One of the interesting things that shrews do in winter is they actually undergo a shrinkage in size. This was first discovered, a study done in Poland way back in the 1940s. And it isn't just a matter of losing fat. The skull of the shrew actually gets narrower. The brain actually shrinks in volume. Some of the internal organs become lighter in mass, and the discs between the vertebrae shrink. And the result is the shrew is significantly lighter in weight than body mass than in the summer months. And then in the spring, as the shrew moves from winter to spring, it reverses those changes. And the idea is this reduces the energy demands by reducing the body mass. They do also store a wee bit of brown fat in the shoulder blade region, which is important for generating heat. But still, I would think when we've had, say, heavy rain and then suddenly going to very cold temperatures, it would be pretty demanding for shrews.
There was also a request about what other animals use shrews and moles as a food source. I think I've seen an owl catch one before for sure, but.
Yeah, owls certainly take shrews. The 2 fossorial moles, the coast mole and Townsend mole, when the young are weaned and are kicked out of the nest, they have to disperse and find a new place to dig tunnels. And they often move on the surface of the ground. And that's when they get picked off in great numbers by owls. There have been a number of studies done on barn owls that have found a large number of moles. And it usually coincides with the time when the moles would be dispersing and their young moles. Shrews certainly turn up in owl pellets. I did some studies on ermine and Pacific martin, and we found shrew remains in the stomachs of both those animals as well. It's not a major food item, but they're certainly eaten.
That's interesting. BJ had asked about if you have a reference for the water shrew work. I don't know if that's the one that you showed, maybe from Journal of Mammalogy, was it?
Was this the taxonomy work or the diving study?
Good question. You still there, BJ? Maybe you could clarify that. I'm not sure if he's on by phone or by Zoom. I'm not completely sure on that one.
The reference to the taxonomy is in the actual slide. He could get the reference for that. The diving studies, they are cited in the handbook, but there were several papers published on that. That all came out of the University of Manitoba. Ken Catania, I think it was the researcher.
Okay, he said he's a U of Manitoba alumnus, so maybe that's what he was interested in.
Okay.
Were there any other? Oh, I see Teresa's got another one, and Murray too.
Yeah, go ahead, Teresa.
So back in 2017, I was researching shrews as part of an art project that was a collaboration between textile artists and field naturalists, and it was a project on the removal of the Elwha dams and all the cascade effect on different species. And one of the ones that was mentioned was the Pacific water shrew, which sent me off looking into shrews. And I found a reference that talked about shrews, not water shrews, but regular shrews, about them moving when the mother left the den, that the babies, the one baby would bite onto the base of the mother's tail, and then the other babies would each bite on, and they would make this kind of conga line, and which sounded pretty amazing and weird. But anyway, there was actually a video online, it's on YouTube, that showed one of these lines of about 8 little shrews zooming along, all connected together. And I think the video was made somewhere in England, but I wondered if this was a behavior that was known from other species of shrew, and because it was sure pretty fascinating. And
yeah, it's called caravanning, and we mention it in the book. Interesting, Glenn Ryder, who else is actually quoted in the book, observed the Pacific water shrew with young caravanning behind it. And there's quite a lengthy description there of his observations. I myself have seen it once, and curiously, that was in Scotland of all places. I was walking down a rural road and some rustling in the leaves, and I looked over, and it took me a moment to grasp what I was seeing, but it was a shrew with some young shrews behind, grasping the tail of the rump of the shrew in front of it. And then they quickly disappeared in the leaves and were gone.
And would the babies at that age, would they be still like nursing, or would she be going off and finding food for herself, and how do they feed their young? Like once they're past nursing, are they on their own after that, or does it? Yeah,
I think that they'll probably still be nursing. Once they finish nursing, weaning, they're off on their own. Yeah.
Okay, you can go on to the others and then come back to me again for my other questions.
Yeah, Dave, you were sort of questioning about what might have happened. You were talking about their survival. You're mentioning up north where they'd be hidden in the subnivean zone underneath the snow. Whereas down here, like, for example, when we had the really cold spell here a few weeks ago, I mean, how that made me starting to think, well, for example, in the coast mole, I mean, how quickly are they able to respond to cold temperatures? I mean, how quickly would they be able to dig deeper down into the soils to be able to evade cold temperatures?
The moles themselves, of course, some of those tunnels are quite deep. They can be a meter or more underground. So the moles are living probably a pretty sheltered existence. Their biggest concern here on the coast actually is being flooded out in the winter rains, more so than the cold.
Okay.
The shrews, I would assume there's, they would have a nest with some insulating material and so on, and would be able to get into a nest and get some protection there from the cold. Obviously, these sorts of things have been going on for thousands of years, and it hasn't wiped out the shrew population. Some of them have managed to survive.
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I was just curious when you were mentioning the difference between the north with snow cover versus down here. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Teresa, do you want to take one more question here?
Well, I see. I thought you
Wrap
said there
up?
was another, I thought you said there was another one in the chat, but
I don't think so. I think we've covered all the chat ones. Most of it's just thank yous.
okay, well, yeah. So again, when I was looking into the water shrew, there was kind of two things that were mentioned. One was that the air bubbles trapped in the fringe of hair on the feet provided enough buoyancy to let them run on the surface of water for up to 5 seconds. I thought that was kind of interesting because you were saying that it might also help to kind of propel them through the water. So anyway, I wondered if that was something that was kind of a known behavior.
Yeah, that's one we've debated and talked about, myself and Nick. We discovered actually a video that was online. It was done in BC, somewhere in the lower mainland. It was one of these strange things you find tucked away deep in the internet. And it was BioBlitz, somewhere near South Fraser, I think. And someone had taken some video footage of what probably was a Pacific water shrew that they thought was running across the water. So we had a look at it. Unfortunately, the resolution, when we slowed down the video, it got very pixely or grainy, and it was hard to tell. The two of us weren't totally convinced that it was running on water. It almost seemed like, yes, there was a little bit of that, but it was actually doing more swimming than running. And as I scanned the literature, I mean, that's been mentioned a number of times, but there are other people who are expressing some skepticism of it. So I don't really know. I haven't seen anything myself, and this video really wasn't very clear to me that the shrew was running across the surface of the water. What was interesting was how fast it could get across from one side of the creek to the other, and gave you a whole new perspective on shrew foraging and how much ground they could cover along the edge of a stream.
It's
And
really interesting. There is another question on here too from the chat line from BJ again saying, is it known how the venomous shrews avoid being poisoned by their own saliva? And what type of toxin is it?
I don't know that. And the types of toxins, it gets into some pretty heavy chemical things that are beyond me, and they're not necessarily the same in all shrews. The toxins differ.
Huh.
Yeah, but I don't know how they are not poisoned by it.
would a shrew, they're so tiny, would they be able to bite you like your hand if you were handling it?
It would do a very minor bite. There are people, I think the only shrew I know of where somebody tried to test the venom was the short-tailed shrew, which is a fairly large shrew. And apparently there was a tiny bit of redness appeared in the skin. But our smaller shrews would, I'm not sure they could penetrate your skin very well.
So in the Elwha thing, there was also, maybe partly because we were kind of looking at the effect of the return of the salmon and how that cascaded through all the other things, of the possibility that a salmon carcass might provide food for a water shrew. Have you ever heard of them eating like something like that? I mean, it just certainly seems like it would be a nutrition source if you were desperate, but I just wondered, have you ever heard of them eating, I guess effectively carrion?
Yeah, well, there have they actually in captivity, which is never a very good comparison for the wild, they've not found a lot of evidence of shrews eating carrion. Seems to me somewhere, I did see observations somewhere of shrews feeding on salmon, dead salmon on a stream. They weren't water shrews. They wouldn't have to be water shrews if the salmon is actually on the shore. But I'm not aware of any study where someone has specifically looked at shrews and to what extent they're scavenging salmon. The reverse is true, that there's many, many notes and papers published on the discovery of shrews in the stomachs of fish.
Huh.
And interestingly, generally, they're not water shrews. So they are terrestrial shrews that have obviously tried to swim across a stream or a small stretch of lake, and they've been picked off by a fish.
Yeah, I have one last question. This is the last one, and it's on moles, not shrews. You were mentioning that the moles' front paws were kind of sideways, as opposed they couldn't put them under it. And that it moved them sideways rather than forward. And I wasn't sure whether, I'll put my video. Whether by sideways you meant like this, like kind of that way, as opposed to like that, which is more how we would think you would dig.
Can you see me, or
I can see you, not your hands, though. I can only see.
can you see my hands?
Nope,
Oh,
they're too far out. They'd have to be closer to your face.
well, if you put your hands out to the side, right to your side, as far straight out to your
Oh,
side,
straight out to the
Yeah.
side. Okay, yeah.
and rotate the hand forward so the thumb and the index finger are pointing to the floor,
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
and then just push directly backwards, and you'll feel an enormous strain in your shoulder muscles.
Okay, yeah.
So pushing back from the shoulder, not from the hand, the wrist joint, but from the shoulder itself.
Oh, I see. And because their arms are so short, it's sort
And
of
that's how they would dig.
is that shoulder motion that's
Yeah.
rather than rather than kind of
Yeah.
digging
No,
like we
it's
think
not
of
from the
digging like
wrist.
a dog digs, they're just kind of moving the whole shoulder. And the other thing is in the photo you showed of the two specimens of the post mole, the photo seemed to show them with the paws flattened, like kind of under the body in both in that particular specimen. Would that just be the way it was kind of pressed for display or something?
Yeah, no, that's the way it was prepared. It's a scientific research specimen, and that's the standard methodology for it. It's not meant to realistically show the shrew mole as it would be in real life.
Just consistently display them the same way you can compare the.
That's right. So you could pull out a drawer and look at a whole bunch of them, and they're all prepared identically, and you can match up the same parts. But this digging thing, it's only when you start to move the arms from the shoulders back, you realize the enormous force that's being put on muscles in the shoulder girdle.
Yeah, no, that's quite amazing when you describe that. I can really feel it. That's really so interesting to think of it, and I'm really glad that you explained it and got me to try it, because I couldn't quite figure out from what you were saying. But anyway, as you can tell, I found this talk totally fascinating.
Okay.
I've only ever seen one live shrew in my life, but
That's a well-known exercise that Dave demonstrated.
Yeah.
It's called the mole.
I think there's one quick question that's come in on the chat line, and that's about whether water shrews live in salt marsh or only in fresh water.
Ah, that is a good question. I think they do live in salt marsh. I don't know to what extent. There are historical museum specimens in the BD Biodiversity Museum. A woman way back in the 50s did a master's thesis on shrews. she captured Pacific water shrews on the beach in Point Grey. They were living in the driftwood right beside the ocean. Now, whether there was some kind of a spring nearby, I don't know, but it certainly suggests that the shrews may well have been foraging to some extent along the shoreline.
That's so interesting. Dave, everyone's so interested here. It's been great to see so many good questions come in. I'd like to take this time now, though, to thank you and let you have a break from all of us. It's been really great. Thank you very much for helping out by doing this talk.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.